whom she was interested in this particular thing. And she, thanks to her advisor, Paula Moya, she has given it a wonderful foundation and has created a thesis that's going to let her talk about public art and its power. She will tell you more about this. She'll be responded to by Rebecca Hickman, who is right back there. And then when Carrie is done, we'll take a very tiny break and can reassemble because we have another group. Okay, great.
Thank you. Thank you, Linda. Good evening, everybody. The subject of my thesis and work of public art is Plumed Serpent, also known as Quetzalcoatl. It is a case study in the politics of place, art, and cultural inclusion. Now, public art communicates civic ideals and punctuates public memory, contributing to the identity of not only a community, but the geographic site in which it's located. And politics of place are dynamic, and they continue to exist. And across the U.S., as cultural perspectives evolve, new voices question the commemoration of certain events and individuals. This is an evolving tension of public memory and identity. Located at the southern end of downtown San Jose's Central Plaza de Cesar Chavez, artist Robert Graham's Plumed Serpent was installed by the San Jose Redevelopment Agency, also known as the RDA, in 1994. Enthused and inspired by ancient Mesoamerican culture, Graham sought to connect people between cultures, ennobling Mexican heritage, and capture the aspirational spirit of San Jose's evolution through the image of Quetzalcoatl, a symbol he saw of knowledge and good. However, ever since, the artwork has been a lightning rod for civic discourse, exemplifying the significance of public art and how it elicits animated democracy. Sitting at the center of civic issues, Plumed Serpent reflects back to the people their social concerns about identity and place. Just consider what is only a sampling of the local news headlines from the time it was installed. Some people saw the art as a monument for San Jose by a famous artist who was a native son. Some used Quetzalcoatl to express their anti-government views. Public funding for the arts is a permeating theme in the discourse surrounding this work. Constituents question how public funds should be spent based on their priorities. Others saw Quetzalcoatl as a religious symbol of an evil Aztec religion that practiced human sacrifice. Led by the U.S. Justice Foundation, a powerful national organization formed to protect conservative political views, a lawsuit was filed against the city, saying that this was unconstitutional because it represented a formation of church and state. So this went to the California court, and the court ruled that it was an interpretation of an artist. And that ruling was later appealed, and then it went to the state Supreme Court, and it was upheld. However, prayer vigils were held at the site. A local church leader claimed it would curse the city. Some pointed to the artwork as hypocritical, as the city removed a major scene from its annual Christmas in the Park event. Some questioned Graham's aesthetics. Some argued that Graham took advantage of the city because it was supposed to be bronze and not composite rock. Some people said it looked like turd, and claimed that Graham intentionally designed a crappy piece of art because he was angry about the budget. And yet many people supported the work, arguing that this its negative press coverage was ignorant of history and religion. And others said it belonged in the heart of San Jose, offering a new perspective of history. So Graham recognized that people perceive art based on their own perspectives. So he said, I figure if I do it this way, there must be millions of people like me. But there will also be millions of people like me who will not understand it, no matter what I do. And he submitted that the work was his best effort. However, through today, it continues to be associated with poop on TV. This is a news story from just 2 months ago about an entirely different work of public art. And yet, the media continues to perpetuate this rather childish association, which I would say is rather malicious. And just last year, our local public radio station continued the association. And just earlier this month, there was a vile tag on the artwork, and somebody spray painted fresh shit on the artwork. I'm happy to tell you they removed it very quickly. But how has this happened, and how has this become normalized in our public discourse? So I argue that these pejorative references to the work reflect a disrespect for not only the art, but subsequently the Mexican culture that it aims to honor, leading to an ingrained acceptance and tolerance, insomuch that this defamatory rhetoric has become normalized and somehow shed of its prejudiced skin. So this fall, Plumed Serpent will celebrate its 25th anniversary, enabling a generational perspective. So for full disclosure, I am the City of San Jose's Director of Cultural Affairs. It is within my purview to oversee the public art program, and we conserve the city's public art collection, including Plumed Serpent. I also speak on matters pertaining to public art, and we are also involved in the commissioning of new public art. However, I did not live in San Jose while I'm a native San Josean. I didn't live here, nor did I work for the city when Plumed Serpent was commissioned. So I was not involved in the development of the piece, nor the design development, or any of the public outreach associated with it. And so, admittedly, I was rather unaware of the depth of this public controversy. And to be quite frank, I was probably slightly more neutral than I am now about the work until I learned more about it. Until I learned more, my eyes have really become widened in terms of how this rhetoric becomes damaging to our community, and also damaging to the acceptance of differences and differing perspectives. So my interest is in the power of public art to capture history and reflect identity, and really anchor public memory. So as we saw from those headlines, Plumed Serpent is an excellent example of the struggles of power amongst clashing cultural perspectives, which manifest in politics and public discourse. So the art in this case is the catalyst of the debate, and also the mirror of culture and public value. So the tale of this serpent is intriguing, and it's also tainted by urban myths that have become a normalized part of the conversation. So the aim of my thesis is to tell this story, to retell and reframe this narrative beyond a sensational headline and beyond a 2-minute soundbite. Through interdisciplinary research anchored in critical theory, I will reframe the artwork and create new associations and new schemas, and consider how this is discussed today and what are the ramifications of that public discourse. So I have reviewed the history of public art, the critical theory around it, and the scholarship surrounding it. I am applying an art historical perspective to this case study, considering the goals of the commissioning agency, also looking at the artist, and also what were the political and social and economic context of its time. I've researched the history of San Jose, including its changing demographics, its shifts in industry and labor, and and I've also researched the Chicano movement. And after researching the scholarship of Paula Moya and Hazel Rose Marcus, I'm applying the social psychology concept of schema, which in turn informs the culture cycle and how public values and histories are shaped. Now, I've thoroughly reviewed public records, including memoranda, artist contracts, public correspondence, including letters, PR strategies, the personal archives of former Vice Mayor Blanca Alvarado, California State Supreme Court rulings, and well over 100 local, national, and international articles. And I have conducted this study with a lens of ethnicity, politics, and how government institutions frame public identity through art, which in turn frames the individual's perspective. However, this evening I'm largely going to be focusing on artist Robert Graham and his work, Plumed Serpent. We'll be looking at his background and his goals for this work, as well as its iconography. But to frame the conversation, I want to provide some definition around schema, culture, and the culture cycle. So culture is the sum value of our worldviews, our perspectives, and our way of living. Now, culture fulfills the individual's need for belonging and provides purpose and meaning. In the culture cycle, the individual both produces and is produced by institutions, and how our daily interactions follow from those institutions, which in turn reflect and support our culture's big ideas. Now remember, art is a cultural artifact. It represents culture. Art means, and at its core, it expresses and is created for a purpose. It's a form of communication. Now, governments have expressed civic virtues through public art for thousands of years. And a consistent guiding principle amongst contemporary public art programs is that public art is accessible, transparent in terms of process, and involves stakeholders. Public art historian and critical theorist Harriet Senni, she argues that public art both focuses and reflects local problems. And she argues that controversies surrounding public art are misplaced. It's not the art that's controversial, but it's what is reflected in the art that's controversial. Public art becomes a polarizing symbol of public value. And how a community informs or responds to a work of public art starts with each of its citizens, each of us, and whose collective experiences reverberate into the public realm. So an important psychological concept to this analysis is schema. Schemas are an evolving set of cognitive structures that organize past stimuli that create experiences and reactions. Now, each of us have an evolving set of schemas, which are learned and can also be unlearned. Together, our schemas create our perspective, which can be shared with others with similar experiences. However, one schema, say associated with religion, might be stronger than their schema associated with, say, gender or ethnicity. So together, our schemas inform collective discourse within a very complex, pluralistic society. And importantly, our schemas help us aid in interpretation. They help us interpret meaning when information is not available. So therefore, schemas guide our interpretation of art. So understanding what schemas are and how they work really illuminate the conversation around Plumed Serpent. Because what is to one person an homage to an ancient Aztec culture might be to another person a resonant symbol of Chicano power. But to somebody else, it might be an ugly turd sculpture or a poke in the eye statement by an artist who has issues with the city and doesn't take the responsibility of public art responsibly. So because art derives its meaning from how it's perceived by others, Plumed Serpent has the ability to be all these things at once. However, some of these associations are more flawed than others because they're based on flawed narratives. and it's for that reason that the matter bears additional investigation. So for context, San Jose's shifting demographics will reveal a layered story of the politics of place and shifting centers of power and industry, ethnicity, and culture. San Jose's evolution is at the heart of Plumed Serpent's story. It is a tale of civic change, aspiration, and the need for belonging in a dynamic society. So since the latter part of the 20th century, San Jose's population has exploded and become increasingly diverse. So if you look at 1950, the population was about 95,000, and in 2017, it grew over tenfold to over 1 million people. And its ethnic demographics have also shifted. Now just bear in mind as I speak to you about this, that the census allows you to identify with more than one group, so the numbers do add up to over 100, but you're gonna get the picture. So in 1970, the San Jose's population was 94% white, 15% Latino, 3% Asian and Pacific Islander, and 3% African American. In 2017, it was 41% white, 35% Asian, 32% Latino, 4% other, and 3% African American. So San Jose is now described as a minority-majority city with no one ethnic group representing a majority of the population. It's also important to note that about over 40% of its population is born in another country. And San Jose's burgeoning industries demanded new labor forces. So fueled by the migrant farm labor from Mexico, enabled by the Bracero Act, the 20th century agricultural industry exported products like grapes, prunes, and broccoli. But the latter part of the 20th century, San Jose took the world stage as a hub of technology when the tech boom led to a suite of products that swept global markets. So a city of aspiration, San Jose was branded as the capital of Silicon Valley. Its redevelopment agency enabled it to invest in capital infrastructure, including public art, to boost economic development. So evolving values, shifts in power, and public policy are inherently linked to evolving demographics. And stemming from a legacy of public policy at all levels of government that marginalized Mexican migrants, Mexican Americans, the Chicano movement led by Cesar Chavez in San Jose was shaped by activists seeking racial equity in education, labor, and government resources. So this social justice movement set the stage for Plumed Serpent, as many of the activists involved in its story came out of this movement. And at the geographic heart of San Jose is Plaza de Cesar Chavez, and this is where Quetzalcoatl is sited. It's the oldest public space in San Jose. It was first the Plaza Mayor of the Pueblo de San Jose de Guadalupe. Later, it was the location of California's first state capital. And then for 60 years, it was the site of San Jose City Hall. And now it's a park, and it's home to events, festivals, concerts, and also public assemblies and marches. And it's surrounded by economic and cultural assets. So this is a place of power and identity. So Plumed Serpent was commissioned in response to the Fallon statue controversy in 1988, led by Mayor Tom McHenry. The RDA commissioned a bronze statue of Captain Thomas Fallon for this park. Now the sculpture aimed to commemorate an event that was significant in San Jose's history: the raising of the U.S. flag after it won a battle in the Mexican-American War in 1846, when California was still part of Mexico. So while some community members supported this work and saw it as a unifying symbol for San Jose, opponents of the statue protested its commemoration. Protesters perceived the statue as representing the hegemony by European culture through an image of an aggressive military act. So this artwork lit a fire of animated public debate about what should be memorialized. Now, to resolve this Fallon statue conflict, the City Council formed a 15-member Historic Art Advisory Committee and asked it to recommend what types of people and events should be commemorated through public art. So among the recommended subjects were writer and activist Ernesto Galarza, agriculture, the indigenous Ohlone culture, Pueblo de San Jose, the advancement of labor and human rights, the technology evolution, the Spanish-Mexican period, and the American period from 1850 to the present. Now these recommendations reflect a perspective that history is evolving, and many events, people, and groups influence the trajectory of a community and place. So out of this process, the RDA commissioned Robert Graham, a high-profile Los Angeles-based artist who had already been selected by the RDA through a competitive request for qualifications process to develop gateways into San Jose. So Graham proposed for San Jose a sculpture of Quetzalcoatl, a Mesoamerican mythological figure, and after extensive public meetings and approvals, in 1992, the RDA contracted with Graham to create this work for $500,000. And in total, there were 7 different public meetings that reviewed the design and approved the design. Born in Mexico City in 1938, Graham moved to San Jose when he was 12. And where he moved there with his family, and his family still resides there. And he studied art at San Jose State and later at San Francisco Art Institute. He moved to Los Angeles in the early 70s, where he later married Oscar-winning actress Angelica Houston, with whom he lived until his death in 2008. So most known for his figurative bronze sculptures, Graham can be posited within the postmodern representational style, also known as realism. After his formal education, his fine art career grew very quickly. He received high-quality, high-profile museum shows, gallery shows, and public art commissions. In fact, one of his pieces can be found right here on the Stanford campus in the Anderson collection. He also was commissioned by the National Endowment for the Arts to create the National Medal for the Arts, which is given out every year by the president to arts leaders. And among his artworks on the left is Olympic Gateway. It was created for the LA Coliseum for the 1984 Olympics. And on the right there is the entrance and the bronze doors for the Lady of the Cathedral of the Angels in Los Angeles. But probably his most well-known commission is the FDR Memorial in Washington, D.C. So it's fair to say that Graham is considered one of the great artists of his time. After the Fallon controversy, Quetzalcoatl was created to instill pride in Mexican heritage through an image used in Mesoamerican culture prior to the Spanish conquest. A reversal of the symbolism of the Fallon statue and the commemoration of the conquest of Mexico and San Jose. Articulating his intent behind Quetzalcoatl as a symbol and an extensive handwritten statement, he wrote, "When I went to central Mexico to study, I explored the great ancient cities of pre-Columbian civilizations. So impressive was the grand design, construction, and symbolism that I was tantalized and tormented by the regret of not sharing this eloquent power and grandeur with the Chicanos I grew up with in Santa Clara Valley. My thoughts were like, if you only knew." Now, Graham went to Mexico and studied archaeological sites for this commission. He studied pictographs and architecture, and he literally held cultural artifacts in his hands. He wanted to share this exhilarating experience with San Jose, celebrating this ancient culture and instilling pride of heritage. He went on to write, "I was so electrified by the indomitable evidence of magnificent native cultures in Mexico. For nowhere in my American classroom learning was I ever made aware of this greatness in Mexico. And everywhere there is a clear symbol of good, and it is the feathered serpent, the mythological figure of Quetzalcoatl." Now, Graham went on to account for the story of Quetzalcoatl, a priest king who, renouncing the cult practice of human sacrifice, taught love, peace, and trust to his people. He was a scholar of astronomy, weather cycles, and the calendar. He was driven from the city by treacherous cult priests. Yet he prophesied his own return at a time when the people sought once again love and peace. Subsequently, his absence caused his legend to grow, and temples were dedicated to him by people longing for his return. Unfortunately, the people mistook Spanish conquistador Cortez for Quetzalcoatl, which led to the hegemonic eradication of Mesoamerican culture through conquests that included libricide and the dismantling of temples and architecture. Centuries later, as the independent country of Mexico sought once again for meaning of its people, the story of Quetzalcoatl emerged as the enlightened priest king of the civilized people who built great cities. As Graham's own work would become controversial for decades, he prophetically wrote, "During this time of great artistic and academic pursuit, it was discovered that the story of Quetzalcoatl had been so corrupted and amusingly deified by conquering cultures that the simple man of pure learnings had been made into a grotesque god to justify their excesses." Now, Graham's representation is based on ancient iconography. He discovered examples of the feathered serpent coiled in repose. In the collection of the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, you can see this example that's similar in texture, form, and shape to his interpretation. And here's another example. In Plumed serpent, imagery is bountiful in manuscripts, sculpture, and architecture, like this Mayan temple at Chichen Itza. And it continues to be a popular symbol in current international iconography and culture. So on the top is Aeromexico's cutting-edge fleet of planes, the Boeing Dreamliner. It has the logo of Quetzalcoatl on the top. Kind of makes me want to take it. And what's the name of this fleet? Quetzalcoatl. And on the bottom is the logo for the School of Arts and Culture in East San Jose that teaches multicultural arts education programs and incorporates a feathered serpent into its logo as a symbol of precious knowledge and learning. And also the figure can be found in contemporary movies and design. So it's for people that are familiar with Mexican art and have a schema associated with Mexican culture. It is a symbol of good. It's a positive symbol. This is the maquette that Graham created for the piece. Now, in the Aztec language, Quetzalcoatl means quetzal feather, snake coat. The feathers are of the quetzal bird, and metaphorically, this is a union between the terrestrial environment of the snake and the celestial environment of the bird. And other associations are fertility, learning knowledge, the planet Venus, dawn, merchants, arts, and crafts. Now, Graham was an early adopter of digital scanning technology. His scale model was then three-dimensionally scanned to generate 1 million digitized points. The digital design was fed into a computer-controlled milling machine, built especially for this project, and then machined in foam, a mold was made at its full scale of 8 by 12 feet. Now the foam model was then molded, and then the finished piece was cast in synthetic stone. Now Graham was really driven by the opportunity to innovate Silicon Valley technologies and adapt them for artistry. And he was really an innovator of his time. And he went on to influence other designers, like his friend Frank Gehry, that used scanning technology to create Disney Hall in Los Angeles. So the work was ultimately installed at Plaza de Cesar Chavez. These are shots from the dedication. You can see it was well attended with some beautiful Aztec headdresses. So Plumed Serpent was Graham's effort to heal the insults caused by the Fallon statue by honoring San Jose's Mexican heritage. As he was born in Mexico City and moved to San Jose as a youth, this work for him was immensely personal. San Jose informed Graham's life, which in turn informed Plumed Serpent. And in many ways, the sculpture represents closure. It's a cycle of conquest and reclaimed empowerment, as well as a homecoming circle. It was an opportunity to close the loop and bring to the community that shaped him a sculpture that he shaped for it. So as we saw from those headlines, one thing that people agreed on is that they all had an opinion, whether positive or negative. However, these associations with this Mesoamerican iconography with turd, I argue, is malicious disrespect for the work and subsequently for the heritage that it aims to celebrate. And for some, this may lead to ethnic superiority or intolerance. And sadly, this topic has become so normalized that the media perpetuates these views and associates it in this manner. And yet today, celebrations continue to be held at the site. In fact, 2 weeks ago was the Quetzalcoatl Festival, and children really enjoy this sculpture. I know it's a little dark, but it was nighttime during the holiday season, and kids love to climb Quetzalcoatl. And in fact, I like to say that Quetzalcoatl gives out free snake rides to kids. And so as I think about our youth, this conversation becomes increasingly important. Because so what? We all love public fodder. Calling it the church sculpture, well, it's just funny, right? And we all have a right to our opinion, right? It's a form of expression and it's democracy, right? But I argue that we have a responsibility to be informed before we speak, as individuals, representatives of organizations, the media, and government, because culture is in the conversation. And it's more than just semantics. And when individuals collectively share experiences, those shared experiences reverberate into the public realm. And therefore, schemas that generate different perspectives become an important factor in the understanding of Plumed Serpent, how it was created, how it spawned controversy, and how it's discussed today. So consider how once we circulate and normalize culturally insensitive statements, it can lead to intolerant discrimination. So with the recent resurgence of white supremacy in the United States, we must be vigilant about language and how discourse can steep into the minds of individuals. A lack of understanding and empathy leads to dire consequences. So just consider the 2017 events in Charlottesville, in which a KKK group and a neo-Nazi white supremacist group rallied and protested the removal of the statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Waving Nazi symbols, they chanted racial slurs like, "The Jews will not replace us." Counter-protests erupted, and then there was a car ramming attack by a neo-Nazi that killed a young woman, Heather Heyer, and injured 19 people. So as we question identity and representation, there's a lot at stake. Not only are we representing value systems, but people. This contest is crucial. Now, Robert Graham's artwork, Plumed Serpent, is a coiled up perpetual controversy that bites through social discourse. Reflecting social issues, the sculpted snake is a lightning rod for animated civic conversation up to today and will be again tomorrow. With its wide eyes, faint teeth, feathers, spiral body and repose, bronze color and rock textured surface, the artwork sits at the center of civic issues, reflecting back to the people their social concerns about identity and place. It must be viewed within the context of its time. And as time marches on, how does the work become revisited by future generations with their own schemas? And how does the discourse in the public realm perpetuate ideas, stereotypes, and marginalization? So in conclusion, I submit that there is no conclusion. Nobody is going to get the last word, but we can change the conversation. Because with its twists and its turns, society slithers forward. Public art exemplified by our dear Plumed Serpent offers a view into humanity and the issues of our times. So I would like to extend my thanks to the Dean of the MLA program, Linda Paulson, and Peter Klein for their guidance and their support. And I'm deeply appreciative to my advisor, Dr. Paula Moya, who has coached me and deepened my understanding of critical theory and cultural psychology and how they relate to race, art, and interpretation. And I'm grateful to former Vice Mayor and former Santa Clara County Supervisor Blanca Alvarado, who's joined us tonight, for her leadership and her trust in me to research her personal archives, which will give you goosebumps, by the way. And I must say the most important for last. I thank my husband, Dan, and my son, Adam, for being my rocks on the Stanford journey. Now I end on this image of Adam on the top and his best friend, Jacob, playfully perched atop of Quetzalcoatl. And I invite all of you to come to San Jose to experience the work. Thank you.
Based on the theory of schema, can you address the monument issue regarding size and scale, and why its size reflects a schema of ideas relating to the San Jose Mexican American community?
Great, excellent question, thank you. I want to first tackle that question related to the evolution of the aesthetics of modern art. So it used to be, if you went to, say, Paris, you're going to see a lot of monuments of people on horseback, very high above us, like kind of like the Fallon statue. However, as a modern public art has evolved over time, and artists are taking a new approach to work. And they want work to be more integrated into the site, and they also want it to be more accessible, because in theory, public art is your art. It's the people's art. But it is also wants to generate a sense of belonging. So as you saw from Graham's interpretation, he very much wanted this work to be accessible. He wanted people to go up to see it, to touch it, and it's very clearly representative of the iconography that we found in Mesoamerican culture.
And my next question is, it's regarding Quetzalcoatl as a heritage symbol for those of San Jose citizens that identify ethnically and culturally as Mesoamerican. How does the association with the Aztec god Quetzalcoatl transform a heritage symbol into a religious one that is framed as a negative argument by those opposed to the artwork?
I love that question. Because I have read, legal analysis around this concept, because that was what the lawsuit was about. The conservative right-wing groups, they filed a lawsuit. And so I read the discourse back and forth between the lawyers. And quite frankly, the main thing that sort of makes it different is that nobody practiced religion around Quetzalcoatl. Nobody's praying to the statue of Quetzalcoatl anymore. It is not an active religion. It is not something that is actively used and people are praying for. Just think of right now, if you were going to go to Greece or Rome and you saw a sculpture of Zeus, right? Zeus it's a symbol of ancient Western civilization. It's a form of heritage. It's a mythological figure. So I would argue this is the same thing for Quetzalcoatl. It's a symbol of an ancient art form. But that became very much a part of that conversation and that discourse. And I will also say that, it's known that the U.S. Justice Foundation raises these issues across the U.S. to raise awareness for themselves, to raise awareness and money for their political pursuits. So that is also part of the caught-up conversation around whether or not this is a First Amendment violation. So there's definitely a politics associated with that lawsuit.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Your thesis addresses schema with regards to changing historical perspectives and negotiation of power. Given San Jose's demographic, how is Plumed Serpent perceived now? This is a two-part question. Do you see a tension in the dichotomy of public art funded by public government agencies as its own form of validation from the ruling elite, in this case, the San Jose City Council, with freedom of expression?
Great question. So I will say that since the Fallon controversy, the way that public art programs has changed their practices. It's much more best practice to be very much public. So for every new work that's commissioned, we have a public body. There's many public meetings, there's a public committee that stewards it, that represents diverse views, disciplines, and stakeholder groups. And then it goes through that public process, there's public meetings, and then ultimately results in the commissioning of the work. But I don't want to be Pollyanna about this. Absolutely, there is different perspectives or different issues that people want to advance. And so that's also very common. Like if you look at the National Mall in Washington, D.C., there's a lot of active discourse and scholarship about the flawed histories of a lot of that sculpture. There's a great scholar, his name is Kirk Savage, and I encourage all of you to check it out. But he really breaks down the actual histories of the different things that people are trying to celebrate at the National Mall, and says, those are not actually historically accurate. So there is definitely an advancement of a certain agenda when you come to works of public art in the public realm. So we need to be mindful of that.
Well, thank you. I am done with my questions.
Great, thank you.
And I guess it's open to the floor now.
Yes.
You're describing this particular work of public art as in effect education about a community and its history and heritage and what it represents. To what extent, I must admit I've been that plaza, but I haven't really gone out. To what extent is the things that you're describing, that this was created in response to the Fallon statute, is that history something that people read or see pictures of when they see this? And is there some context, or is the thing left to stand for itself? Because I'm wondering, part of what you've created here is a way of understanding the sculpture that we wouldn't have had if we had just seen it. So I'm just wondering, what's the next step, or maybe that step has already been taken?
That's a great question. And that's really part of, my aim for this work is to retell that narrative. At the site, there is interpretive plaques. It's embedded, it's flush with the ground. But the story around sort of what led up to this is maybe not that well known. So I really think it's deserving of a much broader kind of dissemination and public dialogue.
Could you say more about, to what extent does the commissioning body for the artwork have a responsibility to provide the education? More explicitly, perhaps. I don't know that I've ever read or seen the plaque in the floor that you mentioned. And you mentioned the artwork about Dr. Ernesto Garlaza, who's somebody I didn't know anything about, but I can go to that artwork and I can read a lot and I can get a sense of him. And I'm like, oh, now I understand it. Coming from Wisconsin and landing in San Jose, I can't look at this and understand it without some hand-holding.
Yeah, I think there's absolutely an opportunity for more interpretation, particularly now that we're much more in a digital culture. There's things that you can access online. We do have some information online, but when you go to the site, you may not necessarily know that it's there. So, those are things that as a steward of a public art program that we definitely have an opportunity to improve, and not just our public art program, but any public art program. But I think, generally, when it comes to art that is site specific or it's there to advance the community or a history of a place, it does help our understanding to provide that interpretation more explicitly for the viewer. Paul.
I'm thinking that if I had come to see this sculpture as a teenager, I probably wouldn't have understood it. It just would have been a snake-like thing, right? So I go to school, I learn more about Mesoamerican history and culture, and so I come to this again as a 30-year-old, and I understand it.
Yeah.
So that's what I do like about this idea many different people encounter it, they're not all gonna have the same knowledge or lack of knowledge. It's gonna be quite different. But my question for you really is, so something interested you about this sculpture, but you did a lot of research and learned a lot about it. So you must have, in a sense, elaborated your schema. So I'm kind of curious what you started with and how that process had changed over time in your own research project has been for you.
Thank you for that question. So, yeah, I mean, I probably came to this project as really wanting to tell the story and talk about public art and how it reflects civic ideals. And it wasn't really until I read Blanca's great archives and these letters, oh my gosh, because this is before email, and people would write Blanca, and they would write these letters, and they would say, Blanca, I'm so happy you don't mind me saying this, but it's incredible. They said, Blanca, I went to the community meeting last night, and I saw that Quetzalcoatl had its first victim in San Jose, and it was you. And Blanca, I'm praying for you. And then the other ones would be these handwritten notes that say, shame on you, shame on you, shame on you. And I could go on and on. I mean, we've got some pretty fat archives that just are incredible. And it wasn't until I saw that probably is what struck me the most. But what I also learned is that you can't just unilaterally say that any Mexican American supported Quetzalcoatl. That wasn't the case at all. There were a lot of groups that represented themselves of Hispanic Christians that actually came out and protested the piece too. So that's again the schemas. So and again, schemas, if you're a Christian, you might associate a snake with Satan, right? And I forgot to mention that, Rebecca. That's another part of what people have these associations around. So I really learned that it's complex, and that if you can't just unilaterally say that if you're Mexican, you love Quetzalcoatl. No, everybody has their own perspective that they're bringing to the perception. Miguel.
I love that you're using the lens of schema in your analysis, and I'm trying to connect your idea of schema with aesthetics. And so a couple questions come to mind. One is, fast forward from 1994 to today, capital of Silicon Valley, San Jose is changing so rapidly. Would this design have been approved today? And related is, how does schema relate to expectations of representation? So if I'm Mexican American, I'm familiar with Mesoamerican history, I've seen other representations of the Serpent. That's not quite what I expected. So I'm just wondering, in your research, have you seen some of those connections, and what did that say to you?
So good question. So I can't answer whether or not it would be commissioned today. I don't know. There is more of a trend to do like technology, art and technology works.
Well, all the Burning Man stuff is totally different, right?
It's totally different. But I think there's a room for everything in the public art collection, because the program actually represents a history of San Jose. It's a history of ideas. It's a program that you just can't have one aesthetic view. But what I would say, the second part of your question, okay, the first part is about whether or not it'd be commissioned today. Now, I watched all these different public videos, and not once in all the design review did anybody say that looks like a piece of turd. Nobody said that. It didn't even come up. Everybody liked it. Everybody thought it was terrific. Nobody brought that up. It's not until it enters the public discourse and these references are things you start to associate it with, and that becomes normalized and perpetuated. So today, if we had all that conversation, then maybe it wouldn't be. But if you didn't have all that conversation, maybe it would. So that's kind of how I see that very much, as you have these associations that we need to unlearn or reframe.
So I wonder how much of that unpleasant association has to do with its placement close to the ground, which was purposeful, but also different from the artist's original plan for the pedestal that was going to be on, and whether there was controversy around that change from his original conception to how it's placed now.
Yeah, so what we spoke about when we had our cohort was, somebody asked me about the design development. And originally, it was intended to be placed higher up, on a pedestal, but that design was redone because there was concern that people would be able to get under there, and maybe it would be like some nefarious activities, because, you know, originally the design, you could walk in and you could look up. But we heard back from like PRNS and public safety that that wasn't really a preferred approach because of the sight lines that you wanted to generate. So I think that was, you know, a key component. But I would argue that, you know, if you look at the Mesoamerican artifacts, they look exactly like this.
Did you research, did you go beyond Mesoamerica? Because my understanding is other, feathered serpents, plumed serpents that appear in other cultures around the Americas and maybe beyond. Did you find any of that?
I didn't go too far beyond Mesoamerican culture, other than I know just, you know, generally some of the things. The bird is a very common symbol, but I didn't go into much further beyond contemporary popular culture. It's a good question. Be interesting to check that out.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.